It has been a long week, but we can't finish out this week without making a video to talk about how the cells relate to anatomy and physiology. So let's get to it. There's some things about cells that you got to keep in mind when you're talking about their role in anatomy and physiology. Like there's like between 8 and 9 billion people on the planet. That's billion with a B, but there are trillions of cells, trillions with a T, that make up you and me. And these cells are living Lego blocks. So just think of the coolest Lego blocks you've ever seen, except these things are alive. And some of them, when they're created, their entire life, they're only going to do one thing. While other cells are going to adapt and evolve and do even more magical things. And that's what makes cells, or the study of cells, cytology, so amazing. Um, let's keep this in the realm of anatomy and physiology though, because we could be here all day. So you got to remember that cells are alive, and that when you get a group of cells that are working together towards a common goal, they make a tissue. And then if you get a group of tissues together that work towards a common goal, they make an organ. And if you get a group of organs that work together towards a common goal, they make an organ system. And if all 11 of your organ systems are working well, then they help to make you, which is an organism. So when you talk about cells, you're talking about the single individual player out of all of this, which is literally the linchpin. Whatever you do to a cell is going to affect the tissue, which can affect the organ, which can affect the organ system, which can affect you overall. So understanding how things affect cells are major. Also keep in mind that typically when you're talking about cells as they, you know, relate to anatomy and physiology, usually a cell is doing one of three things in anatomy and physiology. Usually that cell is making something, using something, or doing something. Like most of the cells that you talk about in an anatomy and physiology course are going to fall into one of those three categories. You can usually take most cells and stick them into one of those three. They're either making something, using something, or doing something. Like, for example, a cell might be making something, like a cell makes a hormone. So the endocrine system, of course, is made up ultimately of endocrine cells that make hormones. And they make these hormones, they make lipid hormones, they make protein hormones, they make amino acid derivative hormones, and they make these different categories of hormones, and these are chemicals that stimulate other cells to do things. So it's kind of like a chemical version of a DM. Um, and so um, they're making something. But then some cells, when they talk about them, these cells are using something. So, for example, oftentimes when you start talking about um, insulin and glucagon, which are two hormones that regulate sugar in the body. Insulin allows your cells, stimulates the body cells to take sugar in. Glucagon stimulates certain cells in your body to increase sugar in the bloodstream. So they do the opposite of one another, right? Well, when insulin comes in and it stimulates the cells of your body to take sugar out of the bloodstream and use it, that's that category. That's that category of cells using something, doing something, using something, right? So you have cells that make things, you have cells that use things, and then you have cells that do things. And the first example that comes to my mind are muscle cells, because muscle cells, whether you're talking about, well, let's talk about skeletal muscle cells. Skeletal muscle cells, they have a special ability. They can contract. In other words, they can shorten. So they have one end of them that attaches to one spot, and then they have another end of them that attaches to another spot. We'll get into the details of this later. So for those of you who are like musculoskeletal anatomy whiz kids, I know this is really basic for you, but we're starting here on purpose. These muscles, they can contract, they can shorten, and by shortening, they cause whatever they are attached to actually move. And those 2 points begin to come together. And so they actually move you. And we'll talk about the law of ludicrous when we talk about the muscular system later. So You have cells in your body that either make something, they either use something, or they either do something, and they fall into those categories. Cells also have these things called organelles. Just like you and I have organs, cells have organelles. It's almost like they're like mini-me's or something. So they have these organelles, and they can use these organelles to do a number of different things. Depending on what organ, and now this is important, depending on what organelles a cell has, that's going to determine what that cell can do. For example, some of the cells of your body have most of the organelles that you learn about. They have a Golgi apparatus. They have rough and smooth endoplasmic reticula. They have mitochondria. They got a cell membrane. They got a nucleus, right? They got all these different things. But if you look at a red blood cell hasn't got jack, right? A red blood cell doesn't have a nucleus. It doesn't have it doesn't have endoplasmic reticulum. It doesn't have a ton of stuff. And so without those things, there's a lot of things that a red blood cell can't do. Now, whereas a cell, if it has, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, a nucleus, if that cell gets damaged, then it can repair itself. However, if you have a red blood cell that gets damaged, it can't repair itself because it doesn't have a nucleus, number one. And the nucleus has genetic material in it that's the blueprint for the cell. So you can always access the blueprint in the nucleus to look and see how you're supposed to fix this thing, to repair it. So with no nucleus, you've got no blueprint. You don't have endoplasmic reticulum. You don't have protein creating organelles within the cell. So you can't repair. You can't make the structures to even repair the cell. So when a red blood cell gets damaged, that's pretty much it. It's out of commission. That's why the average lifespan of a red blood cell is 120 days. That's if it's lucky. Probably on the lower end of that. Because every time it goes flying around an aorta or some other artery, it goes flying at a very high rate of speed. And if it hits one of those walls, it can become damaged. And that happens to red blood cells all the time. That's why you have an entire recycling process of red blood cells. You break them down, whatever's left of them, you recycle what you can use, and you chuck the rest away. So it's important to pay attention to what each organelle can do, because that's going to tell you what that cell can actually do. So another thing about cells to keep in mind is that cells are very restrictive about, and selective, I should say. They're very selective about what they let on the inside and what they don't let on the inside. And that's because the cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane. In other words, it's semi-permeable. It's selective about what can come in and what goes out. It's a double layer of fat. So if you ever look at, like, if you poured a bunch of oil and fat together into one container, you come back later, a few hours later, and you'd find that it all mixed together and it's solidified together. And that's because fats and oils and things like that mix together very well. But if you put some of that fat in a sink of hot water, it will float on top because fat and water don't mix. So things that are water soluble don't just pass through the cell membrane of a cell. It has to be invited in. There's a specific way that it's going to let those things in because they're water soluble. They dissolve in water. They don't dissolve in fat. Versus something that's lipid soluble or fat soluble, it passes through the cell membrane easy peasy, right? So some things have an almost instant effect on a cell and some things don't. And it's important to keep in mind what those things are made out of. For example, steroids. The reason why steroids have such an immediate effect on a cell is because steroids are actually made out of lipids, right? So they pass right through the cell membrane and elicit a response. Versus a protein-based hormone, it has to bind to a receptor site on the outside of the cell. So we'll spend some more time in the future talking a little more about those things and break them down as time allows. If you like this video, make sure you like it, share it with somebody that you know, subscribe if you haven't, and we'll talk more about cells and tissues soon.